What if the most feared weapons in ancient empires were not armies, poisons, or blades, but the whispered intentions of women no one truly saw coming? This question unsettles because it forces us to confront a truth historians rarely admit. Some of the most dangerous figures of the ancient and medieval world did not rule from thrones, but from the shadows just behind them. Their power did not march through gates or crush rebellions in open daylight. It slipped quietly through royal chambers, council rooms, and dimly lit corridors where a single suggestion, a calculated silence, or a carefully timed gesture could redirect the fate of entire civilizations. When you start tracing the rise and fall of certain rulers, the sudden betrayal of trusted generals, or the inexplicable disappearance of powerful heirs, patterns begin to surface. Patterns that rarely appear in official records, but are impossible to ignore once you notice them. Behind many of these turning points stands a woman who was never meant to lead, yet learned exactly how to manipulate those who did. She understood what fear could not achieve, influence could. She mastered what force could not impose, persuasion could. And in societies that denied women public authority, these hidden operators discovered that invisibility itself was the most effective disguise. Imagine the inside of a royal palace, where every alliance is temporary, every smile conceals calculation, and every secret can become a weapon. Now, imagine the person who moves through that world without suspicion, because no one believes she poses a threat. That was the perfect opening for women who wielded intelligence like a dagger. They learned to read vulnerabilities faster than scholars could read scrolls. They recognized emotional fractures long before any advisor detected danger. And once they identified the weak point of a king, a general, or even an entire dynasty, they knew exactly how to apply pressure without ever leaving proof behind. Some manipulated through subtle psychological games. Others mastered quiet intimidation. Some used intimacy and closeness to access information denied to any man. And many perfected the art of influence so deeply that the men around them believed the decisions were theirs all along. What makes this more intriguing is how these tactics evolved across cultures, from the courts of Mesopotamia to the empires of Rome, Egypt, China, and medieval Europe. Different worlds, different rituals, different laws, yet the same unmistakable blueprint of hidden female power emerging whenever opportunity and ambition collided. And as you begin to uncover these stories, one thing becomes clear. History may have erased their names, but it could never erase their impact. The way they shaped war, religion, diplomacy, and succession still echoes through the narratives we repeat today. Their strategies continue to fascinate because they expose a layer of human behavior we prefer not to acknowledge, a layer where power is not seized, but engineered. If this perspective already shifts the way you see ancient power, share your thoughts in the comments. Understanding this hidden structure of influence matters, so make sure to like the video and check whether you are already subscribed to the channel, because what comes next deepens this story in ways most people never learned. Once you begin to understand how these hidden forces operated, the next layer becomes even more intriguing. Women who appeared powerless were often the ones directing the most critical decisions of their time. Their influence did not depend on titles or official authority. It grew in the gaps left by kings who trusted the wrong confidants, generals who underestimated domestic proximity, and priests who believed spiritual authority immunized them against manipulation. These women recognized something simple but devastatingly effective. When everyone focuses on the figure who sits on the throne, no one pays attention to the person standing just behind it. The palace environment made this manipulation almost effortless. Royal courts were built on rituals, hierarchy, and spectacle. Every move was choreographed, and every decision passed through countless layers of protocol. This structure created the illusion that power flowed downward from the king. In reality, power frequently flowed sideways, slipping through private chambers, whispered conversations, and late-night councils, from which official scribes were banned. The woman closest to the ruler, whether wife, mother, sister, concubine, or advisor, learned to navigate these unofficial spaces with precision. She mastered timing, knew when to appear harmless, and understood when silence carried more weight than any speech. The most influential among them were not impulsive. They were patient observers. They noticed tension before conflict broke out. They felt shifts in loyalty before anyone else sensed danger. And once, they mapped the emotional architecture of the king, his fears, ambitions, insecurities, and pride. They gained the kind of access no minister or general could ever match. A strategic remark made at the right moment, a subtle warning delivered in private, or even a calculated act of vulnerability could redirect policies, influence warfare, or silence political rivals without a single public command. Some women shaped succession itself, determining which heir would rise or fall long before anyone realized the contest had begun. Others carefully destabilized competing factions, feeding information in measured doses to heighten distrust among powerful men who never suspected they were being played. In many cases, entire political crises were the result of seeds planted months earlier. Suggestions, stories, or ideas introduced so gently that the ruler believed they were his own thoughts materializing over time. The striking part is how similar these patterns were across civilizations. In ancient Egypt, a queen might guide religious reforms through quiet influence over the pharaoh's personal rituals. In imperial China, an empress dowager could orchestrate military decisions even while confined to private quarters. In medieval Europe, a noblewoman without a single legal right to govern could still engineer alliances, marriages, and betrayals strong enough to alter the map of kingdoms. Different cultures, different constraints, yet the same fundamental mechanism: public weakness, paired with private mastery. And through all this, their power remained invisible because society refused to believe it existed. Chroniclers often minimized or dismissed their actions, preferring to explain political shifts as accidents, divine intervention, or the unpredictable nature of kings. But beneath those convenient narratives lies a truth that becomes impossible to ignore. The person who appears to hold the least authority can often shape the most dramatic outcomes. What emerges from this hidden architecture of influence is a deeper, more unsettling understanding of how fragile public power really was. And as these layers continue to unfold, the next pattern reveals something that unsettled even seasoned rulers. When manipulation evolved into something far more intimate and far more dangerous. As the invisible power behind rulers grew stronger, another dimension emerged, one far more intimate, far more volatile, and capable of reshaping entire empires with nothing more than a private encounter. Seduction, in the ancient and medieval world, was never just desire or pleasure. It was a mechanism of influence, a political strategy disguised as affection, an arena where alliances were forged not with treaties or armies, but with quiet whispers exchanged in the dark. And the women who mastered this craft understood that the body could be a battlefield every bit as consequential as the front lines of war. For kings and generals, vulnerability came most easily through intimacy. In public, they were untouchable, armored by rituals of authority, protected by guards, elevated by divine symbolism. But behind the heavy doors of private chambers, all that power dissolved. Ambition, paranoia, loneliness, fear of betrayal, desire for validation. These emotional fractures were exposed in the one place no advisor or strategist could intervene. This was the opening that certain women recognized, studied, and weaponized with astonishing precision. Some gained access through royal marriages arranged for political stability. Others entered the palace as concubines, attendants, or entertainers, only to rise rapidly through the ranks once they learned how to turn proximity into control. What makes their influence so striking is not the romanticized image of seduction, but the strategic calculation behind it. They paid attention to changes in tone, hesitations in speech, sudden bursts of anger, the subtle insecurity that surfaced during private moments. These observations became tools. A carefully timed reassurance could redirect a ruler's entire political direction. A gentle suggestion framed as concern could lead to the dismissal of a rival minister. A quiet, emotional confession could be manipulated into a promise that changed succession, taxation, diplomacy, or war. Some of the most influential women in ancient courts never commanded armies, yet they decided which generals received supplies and which were quietly abandoned. Others never governed openly, yet they destabilized entire regions by pushing rulers toward impulsive actions justified by emotional vulnerability. Their intimacy gave them access to information no spy could acquire, and leverage no military strategist could match. In many cases, they were the first to know when a kingdom was preparing for conflict or when a treaty was nearing collapse. And armed with that knowledge, they could subtly shift outcomes long before the public felt the tremors of political change. The danger of this dynamic became clear whenever rulers grew dependent, emotionally or psychologically, on the women who guided them. Dependency created blindness. Blindness created opportunity. And opportunity opened the doors to influence so deep that it could no longer be separated from the ruler's own desires, fears, or decisions. From the outside, a king appeared decisive and sovereign. But inside his private chambers, the true architect of his choices could be a woman with no legal authority whatsoever, yet more power than any advisor in the room. What makes these stories even more compelling is how frequently they were erased. Chroniclers preferred to attribute disastrous decisions to weakness or divine punishment, rather than admit a woman's influence had altered the fate of kingdoms. But the pattern appears again and again across cultures. Political chaos erupting after the rise of an intimate confidant, sudden shifts in alliances, unexpected executions, abrupt policy changes, or wars launched without reasonable cause. Behind each of these turning points, there was often a relationship whose true impact was never recorded, only felt. And as seductive influence tightened its grip on the structures of power, an even darker realm of manipulation was beginning to form, one built not on desire, but on psychological control that reached far beyond the private chamber. Once seduction carved its space in the royal chambers, a far more calculated form of manipulation began to dominate the core of political life. The women who truly mastered power understood that influence sustained by desire alone was fragile. Feelings could shift, favor could fade, rivals could appear. But psychological control, slow, subtle, and deeply personal, created a dependency far more difficult to escape. Inside palaces where everyone performed roles crafted by tradition and fear, these women learned to engineer emotional landscapes where their targets could no longer distinguish their own thoughts from the ones being planted in their minds. The foundation of these games was simple: identify the emotional fault lines of the most powerful men. For some rulers, it was insecurity disguised as pride. For others, it was paranoia masked by aggression. Many carried childhood traumas shaped by rigid royal upbringing, where affection was scarce and trust was nearly impossible. Women who operated in these intimate spaces understood these fractures with a clarity no advisor or general could ever reach. They studied reactions, memorized hesitations, decoded unspoken fears. Soon they knew which buttons to press to ignite anger, which words to whisper to provoke jealousy, which silences to hold long enough to evoke guilt or desperation. Once they mapped this emotional terrain, the manipulation became a web. A queen could isolate a rebellious prince by convincing him that his father preferred another heir. A stepmother could subtly poison a king's trust in his own counsel by highlighting tiny inconsistencies in their loyalty. A concubine could trigger conflict between factions simply by implying that one side secretly questioned the ruler's competence. These suggestions were rarely direct. They arrived wrapped in concern, vulnerability, or disappointment, creating the illusion that the woman's intentions were pure, when, in reality, every word was calculated. The most skilled manipulators weaponized vulnerability. A single moment of staged distress, tears that seemed sincere, trembling hands, or the appearance of emotional exhaustion, could break through the hardest armor of a man accustomed to battles but completely unprepared for empathy. Some women manufactured crises that only they could solve, reinforcing the ruler's dependence on their guidance. Others engineered chaos that made their presence appear indispensable. In courts overflowing with advisors, priests, generals, and diplomats, a woman who could position herself as the emotional anchor of the ruler held a power none of them could challenge. Psychological warfare extended beyond the ruler himself. These women also targeted heirs, noblewomen, ministers, and servants. They spread doubt through strategic kindness or subtle cruelty. They used shame to restrain defiant warriors, guilt to control ambitious princes, and flattery to manipulate religious authorities. When necessary, they humiliated rivals publicly to weaken their influence or manipulated private moments to destroy their credibility without leaving any trace. In this environment, a single gesture could be enough to contaminate alliances that had taken decades to build. What made these tactics so effective was their invisibility. Chroniclers rarely documented emotional manipulation because it did not fit the narrative frameworks of wars, treaties, or political decisions. Yet, behind many historical turning points, unexpected executions, sudden shifts in succession, mysterious disappearances, there are signs of psychological strategies shaping the outcome long before the public felt the impact. And as these intricate mind games tightened their grip on the highest levels of power, an even darker layer of influence was beginning to surface, one rooted not in emotions or seduction, but in rituals, superstition, and the fear of the divine. Before we step into that shadow, tell me what part of this psychological world caught your attention the most. Leave your thoughts in the comments so we can explore these hidden tactics with more depth in the next layers of this story. As psychological manipulation spread through the palace walls, another force began to rise, one that blurred the boundary between faith, fear, and authority. In a world where every drought, eclipse, illness, or military defeat could be interpreted as a message from the divine, women who wielded spiritual influence had access to a weapon more potent than any political strategy. They understood that nothing shaped human behavior more effectively than belief, especially when that belief involved terrifying consequences for disobedience or divine punishment for the wrong decision. And within ancient and medieval courts, superstition was not a weakness. It was a fault line waiting to be exploited. Many of these women entered power not through lineage or seduction, but through sacred roles. Priestesses, oracles, healers, midwives, and interpreters of omens occupied positions the male elite could not fully control, because the realm of the spiritual operated outside the rigid structures of political authority. This independence made them exceptionally dangerous. Their interpretations of dreams, celestial signs, or mysterious illnesses could justify nearly any action. A war declared, an alliance broken, an heir removed, a queen dethroned, or a general executed. And because their insights were framed as divine truth rather than personal opinion, questioning them risked angering the gods themselves. Some manipulated rituals with theatrical precision. A sudden trance, a cryptic prophecy, or a symbolic gesture delivered at the exact moment of crisis could redirect the entire course of a kingdom. Others used their knowledge of herbal mixtures to induce visions in rulers, convincing them they had received divine instruction. These experiences felt real, vivid, overwhelming, powerful enough to override political logic. The women guiding these moments understood how to merge spirituality with emotional vulnerability, creating an environment where rulers relied on their guidance not only for political clarity, but for existential reassurance. Prophecy became an especially effective tool. A vague prediction could be shaped to fit any outcome. A specific one could be engineered through careful manipulation of events. If a prophecy declared that a certain rival threatened the stability of the throne, fear alone could justify their elimination. If an omen suggested the gods demanded a change in leadership, factions within the palace would mobilize without hesitation. These women mastered the art of planting seeds that later appeared as divine inevitability. What makes this even more striking is how often male rulers, warriors hardened by battle and trained in strategy, trusted these spiritual advisors more deeply than their own counsels. The allure of divine certainty was irresistible. No general could promise victory, no advisor could promise stability. But a woman who claimed to hear the will of the gods could promise both, wrapped in a narrative that removed responsibility from the ruler and placed it in the hands of destiny. Across the ancient world, from Mesopotamian temples to Greek oracles, Egyptian priesthoods, and medieval mystic circles, a pattern emerged. Women who manipulated fear of the divine could steer empires without issuing a single command. Their influence seeped into military strategies, succession disputes, and diplomatic decisions. And, because their power was rooted in belief, not laws, not armies, it could not be easily challenged or contained. Yet these rituals and prophecies were only one layer of a darker arsenal. The same knowledge of herbs, mixtures, and healing that elevated these women spiritually also opened the door to something far more lethal. Behind the glow of sacred authority, a more dangerous mastery was forming. One that turned domestic knowledge into silent weapons capable of changing who lived, who died, and who ultimately ruled. As spiritual influence deepened and cloaked the intentions of powerful women in divine legitimacy, another, far more dangerous skill began to surface, one that merged everyday domestic knowledge with the precision of a trained assassin. In ancient and medieval worlds, the home was considered a woman's domain. Food preparation, herbal treatments, childbirth care, and healing rituals all fell under her authority. What most rulers never realized was that these seemingly harmless duties placed women in control of the most potent weapons available in their societies. Not swords, not armies, but substances capable of deciding life, death, and the delicate balance of political power. The pantry and the apothecary were arsenals hidden in plain sight. A pinch too much of a seemingly benign herb, a tea brewed minutes longer than necessary, a tincture mixed with one extra drop of a rare resin. These small adjustments could create symptoms indistinguishable from natural illness. Fevers, delirium, paralysis, sudden exhaustion, hallucinations, bleeding that no healer could explain. When a ruler or noble fell ill without warning, suspicion often turned toward male physicians or political rivals. Few ever imagined that the true threat was the woman offering the bowl of broth, the mother tending the bedside, the attendant preparing the medicine, or the wife gently urging the patient to rest. What made these tactics so effective was the subtlety. Poisons were not always designed to kill quickly. The most strategic women preferred slow deterioration, a sickness that appeared natural or divine, especially when dealing with heirs or husbands whose deaths needed to seem accidental. By choosing substances that weakened rather than destroyed, they created long periods of confusion, during which succession plans could be altered, alliances rearranged, or political rivals quietly replaced. A ruler losing clarity due to a controlled poisoning was easier to manipulate than one who died too soon. Some women mastered combinations of herbs used by midwives and healers. Others experimented with minerals, animal toxins, or fermented mixtures that created unpredictable symptoms. Even the most educated men of their time lacked the biological understanding to detect foul play. A queen could eliminate a rival concubine through a tainted cosmetic. A noblewoman could remove an abusive husband with a carefully prepared wine. A royal attendant could weaken a prince to influence who ultimately inherited the throne. Each action left minimal evidence, allowing the manipulator to maintain an outward appearance of loyalty, devotion, or grief. In ancient Rome, sudden illnesses among senators frequently coincided with domestic disputes or inheritance conflicts. In medieval courts, entire bloodlines shifted direction after a mysterious fever swept through a royal household. In the courts of Asia and the Middle East, concubines and palace servants became notorious for using medicinal knowledge to outmaneuver rivals without ever stepping into open confrontation. And in many cases, these women were celebrated, not suspected, because they served as caretakers during the very illnesses they engineered. The brilliance of these methods lay in their invisibility. Chroniclers rarely documented poisonings unless they were blatant. Most deaths recorded as infections, curses, or divine punishment may have been deliberate eliminations, executed so cleanly that history mistook them for fate. Patterns only emerge when you compare the timing. A sudden illness conveniently clearing the path for a favored successor. A rival removed just as political tensions escalated. A wife gaining significant influence after her husband's inexplicable decline. And for women who understood the power hidden in herbs and mixtures, poison was only one component of their strategy. Their knowledge extended to manipulating perception, shaping rumors, and constructing narratives that could destroy an enemy long before death ever reached them. Because once control of the body was mastered, control of reputation became the next battleground. And it was a battlefield where words were sharper than any blade. Once control over life and death became a silent art, another battlefield emerged, one where no poison, blade, or spell was needed. Reputation. In ancient and medieval worlds, a person's honor was not just a social accessory, it was the foundation of political survival. A single accusation could undermine alliances, spark executions, or dismantle entire dynasties. And certain women understood this better than anyone. They realized that while power built in the shadows could be effective, power built through narrative could be unstoppable. Words, once released, traveled through palaces faster than soldiers and carried consequences far more destructive than any physical blow. The process always began with precision. These women did not spread rumors recklessly. They crafted them like weapons, sharpening every detail so that the target's fall appeared inevitable. Sometimes the accusation was subtle. A quiet comment made to a trusted advisor, a vague concern expressed to a religious figure, a whisper slipped into the wrong ear at the right moment. Other times, the rumor was explosive enough to fracture the court before anyone could trace it back to its source. Allegations of treason, heresy, adultery, illegitimacy, madness. These were not just scandals, they were political detonators. Their genius lay in understanding how information flows within a palace. Servants carried secrets between rooms. Advisors traded gossip disguised as intelligence. Priests shared confessions. Guard captains overheard private arguments. A single seeded rumor could travel through these channels with frightening speed, mutating as it moved, gathering credibility with each retelling. By the time it reached the ruler, it no longer resembled a whisper. It looked like truth supported by multiple sources. Women who mastered this tactic also understood how to blend rumor with reality. They planted accusations that aligned with existing tensions. A jealous prince was more likely to believe his brother plotted against him. A paranoid king easily accepted claims of betrayal. A fearful council embraced rumors of divine disfavor. These manipulators read emotional landscapes with surgical accuracy, choosing the exact trigger that would ignite paranoia, distrust, or public outrage. And once the fire started, they never needed to add more fuel. The court consumed itself. Some used scandal to eliminate rivals. Others used it to shield their own ambitions. Many used it to shape succession by discrediting heirs who threatened their influence. Entire wars were started over accusations no historian could confirm. Entire families were erased because a rumor reached the wrong ears. And behind these collapses, there was often a woman who maintained her innocence so flawlessly that no one dared suspect her involvement. What makes this form of power so terrifying is how little evidence it requires. A poisoned cup leaves traces. A political betrayal can be documented. But a whisper, a suspicion, a story that spreads through fear and uncertainty, these leave nothing but destruction in their wake. And the women who engineered such campaigns understood one essential truth. Once a reputation is broken, no amount of truth can fully repair it. Yet, even this level of influence was not the limit. As empires expanded and conflicts intensified, manipulation evolved beyond rumor and scandal into a realm far more dangerous, where women stepped directly into the world of espionage, betrayal, and covert alliances that changed the course of entire wars. Before we enter that realm, tell me in the comments what kind of rumor you think would have caused the greatest chaos inside a medieval palace. Your insight helps deepen the exploration of these hidden tactics. As rumors turned palaces into silent battlegrounds, another layer of hidden power began to surface, one that operated far beyond the chambers and corridors of domestic intrigue. Some women stepped into the world of espionage with an ease that stunned even the most seasoned strategists. They moved between factions, kingdoms, and rival courts with a grace that made their intentions nearly impossible to detect. To many rulers, they appeared harmless, too quiet, too delicate, too insignificant to influence a war. But behind that facade, they shaped the movements of armies, engineered betrayals, and altered the fate of entire regions without ever lifting a weapon. The secret to their success lay in their unique position. While men were restricted by rank, duty, and military protocol, women often slipped through political structures unnoticed. A noblewoman married into a foreign dynasty could gather intelligence at every ceremonial feast. A concubine gained access to military secrets whispered during moments of vulnerability. A lady-in-waiting overheard strategies while serving wine. A widow controlled correspondence that decided the fate of alliances. They operated in spaces where men did not expect danger, which made those spaces the perfect hiding place for it. Some women chose active espionage, deliberately passing information to rival factions. Others became double agents, feeding each side just enough truth to maintain trust while secretly manipulating outcomes to their benefit. Their motives varied: revenge for family injustices, protection of their children's inheritance, personal ambition, ideological loyalty, or simple survival. What united them was their ability to understand political landscapes with the precision of professional tacticians. They sensed when tension between kingdoms was about to erupt, when generals doubted their commanders, when treaties could crumble under pressure, and they positioned themselves exactly where the impact would be greatest. The most impressive among them were those who created alliances no man could have forged. They built relationships through intimacy, empathy, persuasion, and calculated vulnerability, tools inaccessible to traditional diplomats. Their alliances were not written in formal treaties, but sealed in shared fears, secret confessions, and mutual dependence. A single promise exchanged during a clandestine meeting could redirect caravans, alter supply routes, or convince a commander to hesitate at the crucial moment of battle. Small decisions triggered larger consequences, echoing across battlefields and reshaping military history. Their espionage sometimes worked through coded letters hidden in embroidery patterns or disguised within household inventories. In other cases, messages traveled across borders through merchants, traveling entertainers, or religious pilgrims controlled indirectly by these women. No warrior suspected that an embroidered scarf, or a healing salve carried the key to a kingdom's downfall. And by the time the truth surfaced, the damage was irreversible. Some of the most devastating betrayals originated from women strategically placed within the inner circles of enemy courts. They warned rival armies of ambushes, revealed weaknesses in fortifications, or delivered troop movements hours before they occurred. Entire invasions succeeded or failed because a woman passed a single detail at the right moment. In certain periods, kingdoms did not fear generals. They feared the wives, sisters, and lovers who might betray them without ever being suspected. History rarely names these women. Chroniclers preferred to dismiss the idea that wars could be influenced by those outside the official military hierarchy. Yet traces of their existence remain in unexpected victories, inexplicable retreats, and political shifts that made no sense unless a hidden hand intervened. When seen through this lens, the battlefield becomes more than a clash of armies. It becomes a stage on which invisible agents manipulated outcomes with unnerving precision. And as these covert operations reshaped the external world, another mystery began to emerge. One that questioned whether the legends surrounding these women were exaggerated, minimized, or deliberately distorted to conceal deeper truths that history was never meant to reveal. As espionage and betrayal wove their patterns through empires, a new question emerged, one that lingers like a shadow over every account of these women. How much of what we know about them is truth, and how much is a distortion shaped by the agendas of those who recorded history? Ancient and medieval chroniclers were not neutral observers. They were men working within political systems, religious institutions, and patriarchal ideologies that benefited from shaping certain narratives while suppressing others. And the women who operated in secrecy became convenient symbols onto which society projected fears, fantasies, and moral warnings. Some were demonized, others were sanitized. Many were erased completely. Stories of powerful women often grew monstrous in the retelling. Their ambitions became villainy. Their intelligence became witchcraft. Their strategic thinking became emotional instability. A woman who outmaneuvered a king was described as seductive and manipulative. A man who did the same was called brilliant. When a queen influenced policy through charisma, it was labeled corruption. When a male advisor did it, it was simply diplomacy. This gendered rewriting of motives shaped how future generations understood these figures, turning real political actors into archetypes of danger, chaos, or moral decline. At the same time, some manipulations were hidden deliberately. When a woman altered the line of succession, engineered a diplomatic collapse, or orchestrated a discreet elimination that benefited powerful male allies, chroniclers had incentives to silence her role. Admitting her influence meant acknowledging a vulnerability in the political system. It meant confessing that the supposedly orderly structures of kingship could be undone by someone who had no official authority at all. In many cases, her actions were absorbed into the narratives of male heroes, or blamed on divine will, leaving no direct evidence of her skill. Then, there are the blurred figures, women transformed into legends whose stories were exaggerated beyond recognition. Their deeds were magnified into supernatural acts or compressed into simple moral lessons. A calculated act of political strategy became a tale of curse or prophecy. A quiet manipulation became a mythic seduction. A well-planned poisoning evolved into a demonic legend of dark rituals. These distortions served cultural needs, creating symbols rather than real human beings. But behind every embellished tale, there was usually a kernel of truth, an action so impactful that it survived through centuries of retelling. The most intriguing part is how inconsistencies line up when examined across different cultures. A woman described as dangerous in one source appears as wise in another. A so-called manipulator in one chronicle appears as a stabilizer in a different regional account. When these fragments are compared, a clearer pattern emerges. These women were neither monsters nor saints. They were strategic actors navigating dangerous systems ruled by volatility, violence, and male fragility. They used the only tools available to them, and many succeeded where powerful men failed. What history hid most effectively was the sophistication of their methods. Their influence was not chaotic or impulsive. It was deliberate, adaptive, and rooted in an understanding of human psychology that rivaled or surpassed that of any advisor or general. The myth-making surrounding these women may have exaggerated their power in some aspects, but it also concealed the precision of their tactics. It blurred the line between fact and fiction in ways that prevented future generations from recognizing their real contributions to political evolution. And as we peel back these layers, another realization begins to surface, one that connects the ancient world directly to the present. Because the methods used by these women, once confined to royal courts and empires, did not disappear with history. They evolved, resurfacing in modern forms of influence that shape politics, leadership, and social power today. When you look closely at the stories buried beneath myth and distortion, an unsettling truth emerges. The strategies once used by queens, concubines, priestesses, and invisible advisors did not vanish with collapsing empires or fading dynasties. They simply changed form. The same psychological pressure, narrative control, symbolic power, and emotional engineering that shaped ancient courts now operate in boardrooms, political campaigns, social movements, and digital spaces across the world. The dance of influence remains the same, only the stage has evolved. In modern politics, image and perception often overpower policy and competence. This mirrors the ancient battlefield of reputation, where a whisper could fracture alliances before a single sword was drawn. Today, scandals spread through screens instead of palace corridors, but their effectiveness relies on the same human weakness, the instinct to believe narratives that confirm our fears or desires. The methods used by strategic women of the past, subtle framing, emotional cues, crafted vulnerability, now appear in media training, psychological influence strategies, and communication tactics deployed by leaders who understand that controlling the story is more powerful than controlling the system. The intimate influence once tied to seduction or emotional closeness now appears in networks built through trust, empathy, and psychological reading. People who excel at understanding emotional patterns can shift political landscapes without ever holding official office, echoing the queens and advisors who shape decisions from behind closed doors. Even spiritual manipulation has its modern equivalents, found in movements that merge ideology with emotional hunger, creating followers who mistake narrative authority for truth. And those ancient poisons? Today they exist in the form of information, selected, filtered, dosed, and delivered with precision to weaken opponents, destabilize institutions, or steer public perception. The substances have changed, but the intention remains the same: to wear down the target until they are too confused or fragmented to resist. Meanwhile, covert alliances still form quietly, often built through personal connections rather than official agreements, shaping political outcomes long before the public becomes aware. What these parallels reveal is that influence, real influence, has always depended less on visible authority and more on psychological and symbolic control. The most dangerous figures in history were not always the ones who commanded armies. They were often the ones who understood how the human mind works, how fear spreads, how loyalty fractures, and how belief can be shaped subtly enough that people never realize they are being steered. And yet, there is something strangely empowering in recognizing these patterns. When you understand how influence operated in the past, you can recognize its echoes today. You can see through the performances that once would have controlled entire empires. You can identify manipulation not because it is new, but because it is ancient, timeless in structure, predictable in rhythm, and always hiding in plain sight. If you stayed with me up to this point, let me know in the comments with the phrase, "I saw the pattern," so I know you caught every thread woven through this story. And if this exploration opened your eyes to how deeply these ancient tactics still shape our world, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps you stay connected to this journey, where every video reveals another hidden layer of human history. Drop a like as well, if this resonated with you in any way. And when you are ready to go deeper, there is another video waiting right beside this one that expands these ideas even further. Click on it and continue with me through the next chapter of this exploration.